Welcome into Eastern Panhandle Talk. Our guest in the 9 o'clock segment is Scot Faulkner, the author of the critically acclaimed bestseller, Naked Emperors, The Failure of the Republican Revolution, ? He advises numerous corporations on strategic change and leadership. He's appeared on Bloomberg, CBS News, CNN, C-SPAN, Fox, NPR, PBS, Voice of America.
What we're dealing with is, again, decades after decades of spend, look the other way, look the other way, look the other way. And I liken it to like a big couch potato who's sitting there and barely goes anywhere except between the television set and the refrigerator, and they want to run the marathon. You don't wake up the next morning and run 26 miles. You have to work up to it. And the same thing with spending cuts. You've got a huge couch potato, and it's all the collective members of Congress and people in the executive branch and even people in the media. And you've got to get them in shape. And the best way to get them in shape is to do bipartisan embrace of real oversight, go after real waste that's really out there that nobody should be against. And that's going to get them used to cutting things. And then you run the marathon. Then you go after the entitlements. Then you go and look at the longer-term structural issues. But all this folderol right now, it's just for the cameras, because anything that they do in the House, because they got the votes, will die in the Senate. Anything the two of them do, if it doesn't measure up, Obama will veto, and they don't have the votes to override the veto. So this is all blue smoke and mirrors. At the end of the day, you're going to have tons of photo ops, tons of people in front of microphones, and not one penny cut that is a true lasting
any significance,
cut.
Yes.
Scot Faulkner, our guest here on Eastern Panhandle Talk. It's 9:45. Dennis Miller program coming up at the top of the hour. So let's say you get every penny of the $500 billion you're talking about. You're still $600-700 billion short of balancing the budget.
Yes.
Does a tax increase have to be a part of that gap in revenue? You
definitely need to look at, if not across-the-board tax increase, you definitely need to look at some of the tax breaks. I mean, certainly one of the areas, and again, this is where Republicans fall off the wagon, is the whole area dealing with ethanol and all the corn. I mean, the corn...
It's going to drive the price of food up.
It drives the price of food up. If you look at the entire energy equation to create a gallon of ethanol, it actually uses more energy than it saves. And the billions of dollars there of farm subsidies over the years. I mean, one of my favorite jokes is an apocryphal one from many years ago was you walk through the Department of Agriculture and you see this bureaucrats crying, and they say, well, what's wrong with Joe? And they say, well, his farmer died. The thing is you're getting into that you have so many bureaucrats. I mean, here's another example. Walmart, largest corporation in the world. You go to a Walmart cash register, and how many layers of people are there between that cashier and the CEO of Walmart? 5 layers. You go to a national park, there are 10 layers between that ranger and the Secretary of Interior. You go over to the Defense Department, there's 15 layers between the soldier in the field and the Defense Department Secretary. And if you go into the health area, TRICARE of Defense, 20 layers of bureaucrats between the person helping somebody with their health benefits and Secretary Gates. Corporate America flattened their organizations back in the 70s and 80s. To become more competitive. The federal government still has layer upon layer upon layer of people who do nothing but sit around pushing paper. Pass the paper, pass the email, and spend all their day in meetings. That's another area. So, but getting back to your issue, there's some revenue side things. The tax breaks have been layered for many years. A lot of going back to something simple like a flat tax or something where literally you just simply fill in a very simple form and just get on with it instead of all these special interest
measures. You have to let all those IRS people go.
Well, that's right. And they're expanding.
There goes inflation. Yeah. Or there goes unemployment.
Well, but the moment that small business people and others can actually create real jobs,
then we can absorb them.
We can absorb them.
Yeah, yep. People just don't want to be out of their comfort zone.
Right.
Scot Faulkner is our guest here on Eastern Panhandle Talk. It's 9:48. We'll be back. We'll do one of these, and then Jerry Mays, you get first question out of the commercial break.
How come every time the Republicans talk about cutting government spending, the Democrats immediately start throwing school teachers, firemen, policemen under the bus. You know, that's what we're going to do. We're going to have to get rid of all these.
Well,
do you want your community unguarded? We're going to have to get rid of policemen.
We used to call it the Washington Monument defense. We were saying that
we'll tear it down
or close it up.
Close it up. Yep.
And that again is the game that they're all campaigning. They're not governing. And if they would just simply sit down and say, you know, waste is waste. Let's go after the waste first. But what happens is they get into this, spitball contest. I mean, they're like all a bunch of 9-year-olds on a school playground. I mean, they really are not mature enough. And unfortunately, between the parties, the pundits, and a lot of the cable news and all that, they're cheering them on that front. And it's very sad because, again, when you're dealing with 10 layers, 12 layers, I mean, when I was CAO of the House, I walked into a 1,200-person operation, $1 billion operation that served all of the legislative branch, and we had 12 layers between myself and the guys who were moving furniture and running the cameras for C-SPAN, because actually it's government cameras, even though it's a C-SPAN's feed for the floor, and I shrunk it down to 3 layers. I said, this is nuts. And I cut my team from 1,200 some odd to 630. I mean, again, I'm one of the few bureaucrats in Washington who actually reduced the size of my operation consciously because it wasn't needed. And we privatized a bunch of stuff and saved tons and tons, about $148 million in one fiscal year. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket, but it was a start. And the thing is you've got to start somewhere like that. But nobody wants to do that. They want to play the Washington Monument game of saying, well, you know, if you cut one thing. Now, here's one dirty little secret that neither side will talk about. If you look deep in the thousands of pages of the federal budget, there's something called the current services analysis. What that is how much money actually needs to be spent from one year to the next to maintain the current level of services. That means, you know, the drivers of inflation or that never gets talked about. But the thing is what happens in both sides is that they will add money on top of that. And the moment that you cut that money down to basically say, we just want to maintain what you had last year, they scream, look what you're cutting.
Yeah, and it's not a cut.
It's not a cut, it's a ratchet.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I suppose as it's played out this year, one man's waste is Harry Reid's Cowboy Days. And that apparently
that's right, the cowboy poets.
Yeah, that's apparently very much needed part of the economy.
I remember walking in, I worked at National Security Agency, walked in, we had 3 layers of fences, you know, barbed wire park pointing out at the first one, and then an electrified fence in the middle, and then another fence with barbed wire on top. I was walking into the building, and they were in there putting green gravel down in between the in between the 2 big fences. To make it more aesthetic. That was the same day I walked in to have my boss tell me that I wasn't getting promoted because Johnson had frozen promotions. You know, and I'm thinking, well, how about that green rock out there? You know, and that's the silly kinds of things that the government does.
Right.
And there are so many touchy-feely things that occurred from 1966 when I started working for the government, and 96 when I retired, that were you looked around, you had to scratch your head and say, all this does is add to the problem.
Absolutely.
You know, you could easily go and take a 20% cut on every agency in the United States government, and that's from last October 1st budget, not the one that they're planning now, because you get caught up in, I got to add all of this because of inflation. Right,
but the problem there is that it's the people who are trying to defend their turf will be implementing the 20%, which means they'll lay off the park rangers, as opposed to the 2 or 3 layers.
The guys
of
that are looking around the office that they can see.
Or like in education, you go after teachers instead of the maybe a dozen or more people sitting in the superintendent's office that do nothing.
Scot Faulkner, 60 seconds before we jump into our last commercial break here. Debt ceiling being bumped. Okay. Now, what do you do? If you're the Republicans, do you allow it to expire and shut down the government, or do you increase the debt ceiling?
I think you increase the debt ceiling, go for the longer-term victory, but they won't do that.
No.
They're playing to the crowds.
They want to put a Band-Aid on it and still give you a transfusion.
Well, the thing is the budget they just passed guaranteed that you were going to exceed the debt. So if you're already...
How do you reconcile it?
How do you reconcile
You've already done it.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? That's the question. You have a little chunk of time to answer when we get back. Scot Faulkner, our guest for this segment today. Scott, great to have you.
Thank you. It's been great.
Final thought here on what you've just briefed us on.
What we should do is involve the taxpayer in how they spend their tax money. In my book, Naked Emperors, we talk about a referendum time as you file your taxes, where you basically have a chart of accounts of the federal government, a hypothetical $100,000 for each taxpayer to allocate, which might be a penny here and a dollar there, but it'll educate people, and the most important thing is it'll send out a referendum every year on how our money should be spent. And even if it's not binding, imagine how embarrassing it would be for members of Congress to justify increases for programs that the referendum doesn't fund.